Tonight I'm going to share with you the actual draft code. Early in our work on this kind of project, we would have brought you some kind of derivative PowerPoint slides with some little screenshots and whatever. The codes have become so visual that I'm literally going to use the pages out of the code. So what you're seeing up here on the screen is just the PDF of the code document, and I'm going to walk you through some of the key pieces. We won't drone on over every page, but I'm going to try to give you some sense of the overall intent of each of the districts and how those pieces operate and what other pieces beyond the zoning districts are actually in there. I've got the map of the area up here down below. The cover of the form-based code draft, you'll remember, is the illustrative plan from the charrette. That is sort of one way that buildings could end up on these properties. And if you remember, part of that discussion had as much as anything to do with what is actually possible. Not what rights does zoning give you. 7 stories, for example. We had an example in Haywood Road where 7 stories was allocated to the junkyard lot that is next to the Admiral. I know you've all seen it. That lot is far too small to ever accommodate 7-story building and its parking. It just doesn't fit. So we can work back from that to what does fit, what could provide some parking, what could make this site work. That's the same kind of work that was done during the charrette that generated that visual that then goes to inform what we end up doing in the zoning. So the document itself includes some general provisions that introduce the code and set up, especially important for those who might still be in process, some transitional provisions for how existing approvals are going to be treated during the interim period. It sets up each of the districts. It sets up the land uses. It sets up a limited set of site development standards. Those are supplemented by the rest of the zoning ordinance. It sets up its own form-based code administration and definitions that are specific to this code. So here we have the general provisions page. The second one is probably the more important one. It talks about the fact that new development is not allowed unless it follows the code. Really simple kind of thing. And on the bottom here, it suggests that previously issued permits and any pending applications that have been submitted in advance of adoption of the code, those are allowed to continue using the old rules. So there will be things still happening in the area. It might be RAD lofts, it might be all kinds of things that are pending approvals that could move forward in advance of the new code applying. This does include the map, and I'd like to take just a minute and try to describe for you, in general, what each of these districts is intended to do. And so, if we look here, we've just named them RAD 1 through RAD 9. The same way that in Haywood Road, they're Haywood Road 1 through something. So a very similar approach, trying not to give any hierarchy or preference to any of them, not to say that any of them are more special than any of the other ones. The first one is mixed use live work. That's this piece right here on Ralph. You'll see there. And RAD 1, the idea of live work is usually something that looks like a townhouse, but the bottom floor of it can actually be something commercial. It could be a gallery space, it could be a working studio space. It provides an opportunity to have that kind of a space in a building. So that could show up along the back side behind the mountain housing at 327 there, or 372, sorry, back up behind on Ralph Street. RAD 2 is called Mixed Use Edge. That is only here over on the other side of the street from New Belgium Brewing's property. Originally, when we looked at these properties, it seemed only appropriate to zone them residentially. They are near a residential neighborhood, but if you actually go and visit the site, you discover that the neighborhood is actually a fair ways up and over the hill, and these properties sit down at the bottom right where New Belgium is. So it's really just that little edge along the bottom of the road there including, you know, the Burger Bar and some other fine establishments that are along there today. Saw there's 2 houses for sale there if anybody's looking to get in early. The mixed use there would allow for retail that might tap into the customer base for New Belgium Brewing. As visitors start to come to the area, we could see mixed use facilities there. If they show up, it's most likely they'll show up on these deeper parcels right here at that northern end, closer up to where the parking lot for the visitor area would be. The RAD 3 then is this piece in which some people called the Hollow during the course of the discussion, Lyman Hollow. That is a little hidden gem of an area. When you step up inside there, you see that there are substantial hillsides surrounding the entire area. So in fact, a fairly large building fits there without having any impact on anyone, because it's not within the view of anyone down below. That's that piece. RAD 4 is called Mixed Use Raised. The reason this is called raised is that it's the piece here at Riverview Station and also to the north between the tracks and the river where the floodplain lies. So almost every building in that area is going to have to be raised up substantially in order not to flood the ground floor in the future. And so for the moment, we've called that mixed use raised. Most likely, we'll see people actually building up 1 story. The bottom story will be open to allow the floodwaters to move through, and that will most likely be parking down below. And up above that, then would be the development. RAD 5 is called Mixed Use Neighborhood. That is the pieces here on the northern end of kind of the core area north of where the RAD Lofts is proposed to be. The Mixed Use 5 has one particularity in that it runs up along the edge past Phil Mechanic and has a very narrow street, Robert Street, that goes through there. And because of that, then we wanted to keep the height and intensity similar to the way those existing buildings feel along that roadway now. So there is actually a step back required in this area. So up to 2 stories would be allowed, and then the building must move back a little bit so that when you're standing on the street, it'll feel mostly like it's a 2-story building adjacent to you, and then stepped back in the upper story. The next one, RAD 6, is called Mixed Use Shopfront. The Mixed Use Shopfront is the area including RAD Lofts and going down along Depot Street. The Mixed Use Shopfront is focused on a little bit more of a retail experience, and so there's more windows required on the buildings along that area so that you can see what's going on inside, because that's what really creates a good retail experience. So that's kind of the retail core of the entire area. Then RAD 7 is up here on the northern end. Right now, that area is still kind of in its formative stages, but it has one particular thing going for it. It is the one place where you're between the road and the river, so you have direct river access without crossing the roadway. So a very important kind of place. There are a couple of entertainment places there already with outdoor space that reaches down to the river. People could theoretically be kayaking or tubing and stop right there and come up to those uses without having to cross any roadways. So that one is called Mixed Use Industrial because, in fact, there are still some industrial uses there, and for the moment, at least, the district that's been created for that area allows the new uses but also allows all of the old uses. The 8th district is just simply called industrial. It shows up on the New Belgium site and down here between these 2 pieces of RAD 4. The industrial piece is, as written right now, intended as a sort of an industrial sanctuary. It allows principally only those industrial uses. It does not allow residential use, and it really doesn't allow retail or other kinds of uses that might have been allowed in industrial districts before. It is set up to be about jobs and employment. The final district, RAD 9, is an open space district because we have substantial pieces of open space. This is the Duke Power piece on the west side of the river, And on the east side of the river, there are city-owned pieces that lie within the floodway. And so those will be designated open space so that everybody knows they're not to be developed. So that's a general characterization of what those new zoning districts might look like. As we work through this process, the lines on the map may change, the names of the districts may change, we may end up merging some ideas together. There's been a lot of conversation about them, so don't think that this is a thing that is set in stone at this point in time. So in order to understand how each of the zoning districts works, we started out with a series of rules that apply to all of the districts. And they tell you things like how to measure lots and what side setbacks are and what you do with parking location for townhouses and live-work units. They have some general rules for everybody, including a piece shown here that is about having a non-conforming structure. So if the new rules don't fit your existing building, right? If the new rules don't fit your existing building, then you'll be using this section to determine what you can do. And this section talks about adding rear additions, adding side additions, putting a new building in front, what your options are for building on your site if you're non-conforming. In addition, then we talk about measurement of height and how that gets treated, use of attic spaces there, ground floor elevation of the building, story heights, how the step backs work, how the transparency requirements, which are all about the glass in windows and doors and having enough glass to see in and out of buildings, how those transparencies are measured. Blank wall area, which is the opposite of transparency. We want to have, in a truly shopping area, we want to have an experience where the glass is distributed along the shop front, not all on one end and then a long blank wall, because people don't like walking past blank walls. So we try to keep down the width of the blank wall section because of that. There are rules for pedestrian access to buildings and for the streetscapes. And then there are a series of building elements. I apologize, some of them have not been illustrated yet. These building element rules are optional. There's no required building elements anywhere. But if you choose to build an arcade, or if you choose to place a canopy on your building, we need to make sure they're high enough and that they're wide enough to be functional. And so there's some nominal standards in here for those, balconies, porches, and for the two types of raised entries that will be necessary when you're dealing with the flood zone. So some of those raised entries will be internal, and therefore the bottom has to either be flood-proofed or breakaway construction, and some will be external stairs. So we'll have a set of rules that go with each of those. And finally, stoops for those residential properties. So each of the districts is the next piece of the ordinance, and I'm only going to walk you through one so that you know what the components are. I'm going to skip ahead a little. We've tried in each one to give you purpose and intent, the form, the height, the setbacks, and the general use, and then to give you some images. These are not necessarily images here in Asheville. They might come from all around the country, but they're intended to illustrate in the same sort of size and scale the kind of thing that might be built under this district. So you might want to pay some attention to those photos. And if you're uncomfortable with what you see in those photos, we're going to have to change the rules in order to get to the point where we're all comfortable. So purpose and intent. Then two side-by-side pages that open up next to each other. Lot criteria, the siting of the building, access and parking on the site, and then the bulk and mass of the building. Each of those pieces kind of builds one on the other until you know what your building will be. Once you know what your building will be, the final page then is what we call the public realm. It's the space between your building and the back of the curb, and actually includes the space across the street. We're not specifying how the street gets built. We're leaving that to the city. The streets here are fundamentally built today, and so we don't have to worry about creating new streets for the most part. But we will be worrying about creating new sidewalks, making sure they're landscaped correctly, make sure we get street trees, and all those other elements you see here. So the public realm rules are here. So each district is those 4 pages: an intent page, the two-dimensional standard pages, and a public realm page. So I'm going to skip ahead to the shopfront example because I think it's one of the easiest to understand. And so here is the example of mixed-use shopfront. So think of any mixed-use building that you know of, residential or office above, studio spaces, gallery spaces, et cetera, above, and retail on the ground floor. So here's the description of the form. The height is limited to 4 stories, and then there's a discussion of front setbacks and uses, and I'll show you the details of that here as we go through. For the most part, there aren't a whole lot of lot criteria. We're not expecting brand new subdivision to spring up in this area. If anything, people are likely to be merging lots together to create larger development parcels. But there is a very important requirement here on the left-hand side, the maximum building coverage. How much of my lot can be covered up with a building? So in the case of this shopfront, one of our most intense districts in the very center of the area, that number happens to be 90%. You can cover almost all of your lot with a building. The siting of the building. The building has to sit along the primary street, which is going to be, for example, Depot Street in most cases here. It has to sit between 0 feet and 10 feet from the property line, which you can typically think of as about the back of the sidewalk. So the building can have a little in and out going on. It can have a little extra space for outdoor dining. It could have some options, but within that very narrow band. As you move out of this core area, that flexibility becomes greater. 10 feet to 30 feet perhaps in some cases, so that you have much more flexibility in where your building is sited and how it might be articulated. Things that face the river, for example, may have much more flexibility along that edge to encourage a more interesting edge. Here, what we're trying to do is create Main Street, and Main Street is typically a line of buildings all in a line. The build-to zone is the other important part here. In traditional zoning, we set buildings back. We say you have to be at least this far from the road. But in this case, we are bringing buildings towards the street, and so it's a build-to. And the build-to zone is that 0 to 10 feet, and then the width of the lot. That's considered the build-to zone. My building in this zone has to be included for 90% of the width of the lot. Again, we're trying to create a wall of buildings along there, like exists in that area today. And so we have a very wide requirement for the building. As you move to the other districts, if you were to look at that same number, you would see a far lower number, maybe 60 or 75% in some of those districts, where the buildings are not required to be as wide, and there's more open space around the individual buildings. In addition, then up the side street, on the side street, 45% of the lot line needs to have building at it. Okay, so you've got to set that building both up and along, if you happen to be a corner lot, along that side lot line. Access and parking, there's a limit on the driveway width. One-way and two-way aisles are limited here, and there are parking setbacks. The principal reason for the parking setbacks is to make sure that the building is the most prominent thing behind the sidewalk. So the parking is actually pushed at least 30 feet back. When you do that, you can have a 30-foot depth of, say, a retail space in the front of the building, and then you could have an overhang and tuck under parking. You could actually have habitable space back behind that parking was tucked underneath. But we don't want the parking out there right at the street edge. And so we set the parking setback to move the parking into the site. On the side street, on the other hand, that's not as important as the primary street. The parking setback's only 10 feet. So there would be a landscaped piece of 10 feet wide as you went up the side of the building where the parking lot was. The final piece here is building height. In this case, maximum height, 4 stories, 55 feet. So 4 stories means that we get gracious story heights. Someone might look at 55 feet and say, oh, the building code only requires ceilings 7'6" tall. I'm going to squeeze in 1 extra story in there. which would be a terrible outcome. It generates cheap space, and it's typically deemed low quality, especially if we were to go around and talk to the artists. What do they like in their space? They like big, high ceilings and lots of light. So these are a possibly tall building of 55 feet, but within that, only 4 stories. So it allows for a tall ground floor for retail purposes, and the other floors can also be taller than normal if the applicant chooses. Light industrial uses, if they get developed in this zone, are allowed to be only 24 feet in height and 2 stories. 2 stories is the minimum height for all uses, and for industrial uses it would be 1 story at 24 feet. So a building as tall as a 2-story building, but for industrial it would only be required to be a single story. The final piece is street-facing building length. So along the primary street where we've made the building wide, if you have a very long, very large parcel, you'll have to put 2 buildings on it because each building can only be 200 feet long. And just to give you some perspective, a small downtown block is 200 feet. So it's a building as big as a downtown block. It's not exactly a tiny little thing. But we don't want it much, much longer than that. We need access back to parking back behind. We need to feel as though the buildings are broken up along the street. And therefore, there'll be a number in each of them that covers that building mass question. So the final piece in each district is about the public realm. And so, for example, here are the transparency settings, the amount of blank wall and the amount of glass. This is the area that would have the highest glass because these are the shop fronts pulled right up to the street. We want you looking in at what's going on. That's what makes for the kind of vibrancy and activity along the street edge. We set story height here as well for the ground story, taller. For the upper stories, not quite as tall. The tall ground story has to do with being able to put high-quality retail spaces in those areas. So 12 feet for the ground story for the retail and 9 feet above for office or residential that might be in upper stories. Pedestrian access, there is an entrance facing the primary street required. So you have to, even if your parking lot's over here on the side or back behind, you have to have an entrance out there on the street. And that entrance on the street has to be spaced no more than 50 feet from the edge of your building, or if you have a very long building, from the next entrance. So you could have a 100-foot long building with the entrance right in the center, right? Or if you had a 150-foot long building, you'd need 2 entrances, kind of 50 feet each, in order to break that up. What that does is make sure we get at least some articulation in the facade. We get different entrances for different uses. It helps break up the spaces. And you'll see this one is set the lowest because these retail areas have the smallest spaces in them typically, whereas some of the other zones are going to have 75 or 100 feet for that spacing in between doors. There are allowed building elements, none of them required, but arcades, awnings, canopies, balconies, and stoops are all allowed on a building in this zone. There are, the building setbacks are replicated simply because we have drawn them on the image here. And then there are the streetscape requirements, an 8-foot sidewalk or a 6-foot sidewalk on a side street, a 6-foot planting strip, and a tree lawn or trees in grates along the street, placed 30 feet apart on average. Now, in certain cases, and it could be that Robert Street is a good example of this, the area is so narrow already that we're never going to get this streetscape in there. So there is this little asterisk with the streetscape that says modified dimensions may be approved by the city traffic engineer. So there's an opportunity to work with the city and try to determine what the priorities for fitting this streetscape into something less than the whole if you don't have room enough for that whole streetscape. And in these redevelopment settings, this might be fairly frequent. When you find you're doing a completely new building on a quite large site, then this won't be an issue at all. You'll be able to meet the standards. So that's what each of the districts look like. I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but I would like to walk you through some of the additional elements of the code. Land use is one of the next things. And it's important to note that use here is a very large table, and it has a number of named uses. But if a new use comes along that we haven't got in the table or that nobody's ever heard of before, I still remember when I first heard about an auto spa. I had no idea what that was. Turns out it was just a car wash. So we had car wash in the table, but we could make an interpretation that auto spa was a car wash, right? That's something you do at the staff level. It can be appealed if someone feels you got it wrong. Those interpretations about uses can be made. And this set of requirements is a set of things that help the administrator of the ordinance think about the interpretation of uses. So things like the customer type, the amount of sales for various uses, the building and site arrangement, the hours of operation, all of those help you know whether something's similar to something else. In addition, there is a small set of prohibited uses. These are all carried over from the existing river district. We've just said if they were prohibited before, let's prohibit them again. Slaughterhouses, asphalt plants. These are the most heavy of the heavy industrial uses, which even in the former river district weren't allowed. Then there's a little discussion of how accessory uses work. Basically, in a mixed-use setting, there is no real difference between the principal and the accessory use. If there's 5 uses in the chart all allowed in your building, you can have any of the 5 in any mix you'd like, including all one or all another, etc. So this is what the use table looks like. These are the districts across the top, RAD 1 through 9. There are categories here: residential, public and institutional, recreational, food, beverage and entertainment, lodging, retail, service and office, and industrial. And finally some miscellaneous pieces added on the end. So that use table will tell you whether you're a P, a permitted use, that means go to the counter, get your permit, basically. Whether you are an S, permitted subject to specific standards that are set out in the code, and I'll show you an example of those in a minute, but still allowed by right, provided you meet these additional standards. Or finally, conditional use. This is the CUP that goes to, right now, to the City Council for consideration. These are things that we're not really sure fit, and they need to look at the siting and the adjacencies and see whether it's appropriate to use that use there. So the table is a fairly easy read. I think nobody will really have any trouble getting in and understanding it. The final thing about the table is if there are any standards for these uses, and the S's and the C's will likely have standards, they're linked off on the right-hand side there. Some are in the current zoning code, they're linking back to the old code, and some are specific to this area, and they're found here. So for example, parking decks, garages, or structures have a set of specific uses talking about screening of the parking structure and how their entries have to function. So those are additional rules. You still get to have it by right, but you have to follow these additional rules for the parking structure beyond the rules that you've already seen, right? So this is an example of specific standards for a use. Finally, there are a set of development standards in the code. The development standards are the other rules which are generic across all of the districts within the River Arts District. So for example, this is the required parking table. It shows how much vehicle parking and how much bicycle parking is allowed for each kind of use. And these are somewhat relaxed standards, but because we have parking issues here, you'll find that there still are some parking requirements. Unlike the downtown, where we exempt people from these parking ratios, and we only tell them how to design their parking lot, here, many of the uses still have parking requirements. There's information about how bicycle parking is accommodated in here. There's vehicle loading requirements in this section. There's a small section on landscaping and screening. Again, much of the landscaping is in the regular zoning ordinance, and so this points back there. But in addition then, we have set a buffer, which is really a boundary buffer on the outside edges of the River Arts District. If we have our more intense things there, like commercial uses that might sit across from New Belgium Brewing, on the back side of that, they'll have to buffer against the adjacent neighborhood. In addition, then, we have a full sign code embedded in here. The city does not have a sign code other than the one that we worked on for Haywood Road that is really good for this kind of pedestrian zone. There is a sign code for the downtown, but the sign types it allows are much too intense to be allowed in this specific area. And so each of the sign types are shown here and which districts they're allowed in, and then the rules for each sign type are on the following pages. And they're, for the most part, rules about the dimensions, et cetera, of the signs. One thing we discovered today in talking about it that no one quite knew that will be more flexible if this sign code is adopted is that the projecting sign that you see here, which is allowed to be up to 9 square feet, 3 foot by 3 foot, that projecting sign is, in my mind, a freebie. Every entrance to your building can have a projecting sign. So, for example, we were talking about the pink dog. Pink dog, did I get that right? Thank you. Close counts. That pink place with all the pictures on it. They have lots of external doors that are artist studio spaces that today are not allowed to have signage because the signage is for the building only. So in this case, projecting signs are allowed in addition to the wall signage and other elements because we find them to be an excellent part of pedestrian wayfinding. When I walk down the street, the most useful thing in the world is a projecting sign like this. It's not focused on the automobile traffic, although they may get some benefit from it. It's really focused on the pedestrians. So if you want to help people find those ground floor spaces and those entrances, put a sign outside each one and tell me what's inside there. Get me excited by showing me a great looking sign like some of these. So there is a full sign code in here with a variety of types of signs, and included at the back end of that is a set of rules about illuminating signs to make sure that we get signs that remain in character here. There are options to light these signs, and whether they're internal or externally illuminated is set aside there by sign type. So each of the sign types can either be internally or externally illuminated or both. There is a final section on outdoor display and storage. This is important because outdoor display is the idea that you bring something out of your shop and you show it off during the day, and at night it goes back inside. That's outdoor display. On the other hand, if you've got a big something that you leave outside all the time, that's outdoor storage, right? So we want to regulate both, but we want to have a fairly light touch on these things. We don't want outdoor storage between the building and the right-of-way, but outdoor display should be acceptable in most of these areas, provided you leave adequate sidewalk width. And so there's the description of how that works in here. There's a little piece on administration. The form code is really administered as though it were, I believe, a level 2 site plan at the city, for those of you who are wonky about this stuff. But basically, the staff reviews the site plans, and will continue to review the site plans in this area. At a certain complexity of project, it's possible that those things will be reviewed at higher levels. But for the moment, we basically said, follow these rules, get your permit. If you're a conditional use, that's going to go on up through a more discretionary process. But otherwise, for the most part, if you're a permitted use or one of those S's with special conditions, you'll be able to get your approvals at the staff level. The final thing in here is just a few definitions and some lawyerly language that lets you know that if the graphic conflicts with the text or the photograph conflicts with the text controls. That makes the lawyers very happy. So there's a lot of pictures and diagrams in here, but in the end, it's the text that is the most meaningful element if we ever have an interpretation or we have to go to court. So you've just been introduced to the entire form-based code for the River Arts District. What we'd like to do now is we'd actually like to, we're set up in the lobby with a bunch of the maps and a bunch of copies of the code, and we'd like to talk to you there more one-on-one so that you can ask questions about your specific property. So we're going to step outside to the hallway. There are a whole series of planners. I'll be out there for a little bit, and we can talk about this. Before you leave, there's a little comment card out there. We would love to get some little written comments. It's going to ask you basically what did you like and what didn't you like about what you heard tonight. That will start us down the path of thinking about how we revise this draft code. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and I look forward to chatting a little further in the hallway.